Hello there, I'm Dr. Gregory Sadler, and this is the fifth in a series of videos that I'm creating for what we might call lifelong learners or self-directed study participants, people who want to study philosophy largely on their own, but using the resources that are available on the internet. So people who aren't doing academic study of philosophy in the traditional university or college setting, but who have a desire or indeed even a passion for the life of the mind. And this video is on somebody who I think is really important, kind of undervalued by many philosophers, and I actually would say unknown by many of them as well, but somebody who's a big favorite of mine, and I actually sometimes say that I model my own work after his, and that is Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great Roman, not just philosopher, but also orator and lawyer and statesman, somebody who had a major impact on history, not just in terms of what he did in the Forum or in the Civil Wars or those sorts of things, but also in the world of letters, as we'll talk about in just a little bit. So this is hopefully going to give you some helpful advice about how you would begin to study Cicero. One of the questions that I always want to address early on in these videos is very simple. Why should I study Cicero? Why should I put in time that I could be spending, if not doing something other than philosophy, maybe on somebody who I know is a big heavy hitter in philosophy, like David Hume or René Descartes or Augustine of Hippo or Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle, people that I know I'm going to get a lot out of. And there's a lot of good answers to that I'm going to provide you here. One is that when you actually start looking into Cicero, you realize that he is an important figure in the history of philosophy, and that's for several reasons. One of them has to do with the fact that because of the project that he had, and because of the way that philosophy developed in the West, particularly during the Middle Ages, but also during the Renaissance and the modern period, Cicero, in effect, became one of the main sources that we have for quite a few schools of ancient philosophy. So, when it comes, for example, to the Epicurean school, we have Epicurus's writings. We've lost most of those. We have some of Philodemus' stuff, which is being translated as we speak. We have Lucretius's On the Order of Things, which, by the way, Cicero may have edited. And then we have Cicero's own writings. Cicero's not an Epicurean, and he's actually kind of hostile to them at many points, but in On the Ends, Book 1, in On the Nature of the Gods, Book 1, in other works as well, he provides us with a fairly decent, sometimes systematic and comprehensive understanding of what it was that Epicureans actually thought and taught and applied in their philosophy. Same thing goes with Stoicism. There's a lot that we know about the Stoics only because Cicero happens to have written about it in his works. Like, for example, On Duties, we've lost Panaetius's text. Panaetius was a middle Stoic, but we have Cicero's text, and Cicero may not be a Stoic himself, but we learn a lot about Stoicism from him. And similarly with the academic skeptic school that we're going to talk about. And there's even things about Aristotle and the Peripatetic school, other, lesser known figures and movements within philosophy that Cicero's works provide us with. So that's one reason. That's particularly important. And it's good to keep in mind that Cicero's works, except for his letters for the most part, which were rediscovered later in the Renaissance, they were preserved more or less. We'll talk about that in just a bit. in the Middle Ages in monasteries, and then they made their way into universities. So Cicero is one of the main sources providing an understanding of ancient philosophy that supplements that of the church fathers, like, say, Lactantius or Clement of Alexandria, and supplements other pagan authors like Plutarch, who are quite important. So this is one important reason by itself. I think another reason why you should think that Cicero is important is because up until the 19th century, the early part of the 19th century, everyone else thought he was important. I mentioned David Hume earlier, and there's a good reason why I brought him up. David Hume cites Cicero constantly in his works because Cicero was considered very important, more important than Aristotle within that 18th century philosophical milieu, where Aristotle was actually associated with sort of a moribund scholasticism. Cicero was being discussed all the time and providing useful information about previous modes of philosophy that people were interested in and arguments that they were having. Hume, actually, if you know Cicero's works and then you look at Hume's works, his dialogues on natural religion uses a lot of the same sort of structure as Cicero's on the nature of the gods. And you can only see that if you actually read the Cicero and you read the Hume. So there were many other philosophers up until about the end of the 18th century who considered Cicero to be very important to not just the history of philosophy, what was going on in the past, but, as a model for how to understand philosophy, what issues are important. And that changed in the 19th century, and we'll talk about why that's the case in just a bit. Another thing that I think, argues for why reading Cicero is important is that he provides you with a very nice model for how to do philosophy in a comparative way and a eclectic but also systematic way. Cicero often is talked about as being unoriginal and, he's just sort of regurgitating what other people have put out there. That is not the case at all. All you have to do is read his works and you see he's a very intelligent interpreter of previous philosophical thought. He's adapting it to new circumstances. He's probing into different systems and doctrines and seeing what's really there, coming up with good arguments. He's weaving together a very interesting picture that we can enter into and then explore on our own. And we have a lot of his works, so that's quite good. And then the last reason why I think you would want to read Cicero is he's enjoyable. He's a good writer. A little bit of an acquired taste. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But he really is worth, following along and seeing what he has to say. He's taking the great philosophies and sort of placing them in relation to each other and delving into issues, making distinctions where they need to be made. So if you like that sort of thing, you are going to like reading Cicero. So those are some good reasons for delving into his corpus, his body of work. Another question that people want me to answer early on has to do with texts and translations and editions. So I have to admit that, quite frankly, I don't like survey the whole field of translations that's available, in part because I can read Latin, and so I'm very partial to these Loeb texts. I'm also used to reading more old-fashioned, less contemporary readable translations, so I don't really have too much of an issue with that. And these are very nice to have. So this is a Rackham translation, right? Rackham, you're reading something kind of Oxford-y, and it may be a little bit out of date for you. But what's really cool about these Loeb editions is you have the Latin on one side and the English on the other. So, if you can read the Latin, or if you want to start learning Latin, although you don't want to start with Cicero, I'll tell you about that in a moment, you can compare them back and forth. And that's quite nice to be able to do. So, these are some of my Loeb collection. I don't have all of his works, but maybe someday I will. Now, there's also some more recent editions and translations that I think I would like to call your attention to. So, Cambridge Texts in the History of Philosophy and Cambridge Texts in the History of Political Thought has been putting out these new translations of Cicero's works. So these are, quite nice, usually quite affordable. They come with a good historical introduction, some notes on translation. They come with a sort of summary of that. You can't get all of Cicero's works in that form, but maybe down the line you will be able to. And there's, they're heavily footnoted as well, which is quite nice. So I have, On Duties here, and this is a library edition of On Moral Ends, which I'm currently working on with a student of mine. One other one that came to my attention recently, which I'll be reviewing in the coming months, is in that new series by Princeton University Press. This one is How to Be a Friend. Now, it's actually a translation of something that we call the On Friendship, the De Amicitia, by Cicero. And again, comes with a little bit of an introduction. Same thing here, facing pages, Latin and English. So that's kind of nice to do. That's not going to happen to all of Cicero's works because the De Amicitia, or the On Friendship, is a rather short work, whereas Tusculan Disputations is quite long. On the Ends is quite long. The Academics on the Nature of the Gods, those are quite long. So I don't think you're going to see them in those forms. But those are decent editions to get. I will say this, that Cicero is, because of his style, we actually talk about Ciceronian style, and sometimes we'll use the word Ciceronian periods. Latin allows you to write in these massive paragraph-long sentences that convey all these different shades of meaning and connection, because Latin is a different kind of language than English is. It's a case language. And Cicero took full advantage of that. I'm actually going to tell you a little story here. Usually I don't do too much of that in these, but you might get a kick out of this. So when I was learning Latin in a serious way, because I'd had to actually take Latin in 6th and 7th grade, but it was baby Latin, it was for 6th and 7th graders. And then I didn't really do anything with it until later on. I actually didn't do anything with it in undergraduate, and it wasn't one of the languages that I was studying in between undergraduate and grad school. But I always like to, collect Army field manuals. And there was an Army field manual that was written for JAG officers. These are the people who they're the judicial branch of the Army. And it was a teach yourself Latin book for officers. And so I got that. And early on in my graduate studies, I worked my way through the whole thing. And then I was like, all right, now I actually know a lot of Latin. Let's go to the library, because I knew from, French and German that the next thing to do is find some books and start reading them. And I was like, I should read Cicero. That would be kind of fun. And so I went and I got the Academics out of the library, and I spent an entire semester just working my way through 10 pages. It was so difficult, I had to struggle so much. And that was because Cicero is difficult in Latin. And then I said, oh man, I really need to do more work. So I went and I bought myself an Allen and Greenough grammar, worked through the entire thing, and then started reading easier authors like Thomas Aquinas and Anselm of Canterbury, who's a little bit, tougher, and then, proceeded on eventually to read authors with the complexity of style of Cicero and Augustine, right? Those are sort of like, mastery level texts. But why am I telling you all this? Well, this structure to Cicero's writing also sort of pervades the English translations of his text. So you want to be attentive to that. It is complicated stylistically, and that's because they're good translations. If you tried to simplify Cicero, you would actually be deviating from the text. Another thing that I do want to bring up about texts, so we do have a lot of his body of work, but we don't have all of it. There are some that are either missing, like the Protrepticus, which we're going to talk about in just a bit, or which are rather fragmentary. Another example of that would be his dialogue on fate, which we'll also talk about in just a bit. But on the laws and on the Republic and some of the other works are also fragmentary. That means we don't have all of the work. And this is a very common issue in ancient philosophy, unless we're extraordinarily lucky and we discover a manuscript somewhere preserved in, jars, or, because of an eruption or in some catacomb or something like that, we're probably stuck with what we've got. So, that's probably enough to say about the texts themselves. Now, the next question that we want to go into is, especially if you're a beginner, where do I start? With some philosophers, it's really easy. They may have written a book like The Introduction to My System, or Here's How to Get Started. Like if we were doing Kant, we might say, well, let's read the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. That might be the spot to begin. Or if we're doing Plato, we might say, well, the Ion or the Apology, those are easy. Unfortunately, we don't have the one book that we probably would want to start with, and that is the Hortensius. The Hortensius, it's a character, Hortensius, in a dialogue, is a protreptic, a way to try to argue somebody into studying philosophy, talking about why philosophy is very important. And apparently it was a fairly short work, so, that would have been a great one to start with. We know of people reading it, like Augustine of Hippo, who said that it made him want to study philosophy, so it must have been pretty good, but we don't actually know much about it, unfortunately. So that one we have to put to the side. So I think there's a lot of different ways one could get into Cicero. I mean, you could jump into one of his big, thick books if you wanted to, like, the On the Ends, or the Academica, or, the Tusculan Disputations, or you could start with reading some of his speeches. But here's what I'm going to say. I think that if you haven't read any Cicero up to this point, why not start with 3 short works that give you kind of a good representative idea of what his approach is and what his project is like. And so those 3 works would be the On Friendship, Stoic Paradoxes, and On Fate. Now, the On Friendship is mostly Aristotelian. Cicero is actually drawing on Aristotle's ideas in the Nicomachean Ethics, books 8 and 9, and Eudemian Ethics, I think it's book 7, where he's talking about friendship. And he's rethinking this stuff and putting it into a Roman context, adding some new twists to it, like thinking about, when should you actually break off a friendship and when shouldn't you, and questions along those lines, or how much virtue does a virtuous friend have to have. So that's a nice, accessible, fairly easy read. I think it's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of name dropping, but that's okay. You can look those people up. And then the Stoic Paradoxes is also a short work. It's also good to, and this goes for the On Friendship, because Cicero tells you a little bit about what his project is in the introduction that he writes to these works. The Stoic Paradoxes it begins with Cicero complaining that the Stoics have some really great ideas, but they don't use rhetoric at all. They don't use, what we would call effective communication to get their points across, and so he's going to do some of that. So that's a book that's worth reading. And then the On Fate. Now, On Fate is a we could say fragmentary text in that we don't have the whole thing. We do have a nice big section. And he is discussing this question of fate and free will. Do we actually have any free choice of our own, or is everything that we do going to be fated in one way or another? And he examines a number of different positions on this, which include not just, schools that you might have heard of, like the Stoics or the Epicureans or even the academic skeptics, but he also examines Diodorus's Megarian position on it. He brings up a few other people. He talks about an argument called the lazy argument that's well worth looking into. And so I think if you put those three texts together, that's a nice starting place for Cicero. And then you got to think about, well, what do I really want to get into? I mean, ideally, you'd read all of his philosophical works. I think that's a great thing to do. But you might be attracted to Cicero because you know that he deals with something that you're particularly keen to study. So if it's Epicureanism, you probably want to look at On the Ends and On the Nature of the Gods and the Academica. Academics, right? And that's probably, where you're going to find the most interesting stuff that's being discussed there. On Fate, of course, talks about Epicurus, too. If you're interested in Stoicism, there's a wider range of texts that you would look at. So those texts that I mentioned already, and then you would look at the On Duties. You would look at the Tusculan Disputations. You would also look at his book on divination, because it deals with the Stoics' conception of determinism and whether there is any freedom or possibility of doing things differently. You might also be interested in Cicero for the sake of studying rhetoric or the relations between rhetoric and philosophy. And he's got quite a few books, like On the Orator, the Topics, a number of other works that you would delve into. And there you're going to find out that Cicero is also, in many respects, kind of Aristotelian. He thinks of rhetoric as something that a philosopher ought to have. Not in the way that the rhetoric teachers did, where it's all sort of formal exercises and how to push people's buttons. He's very similar to Aristotle in that he thinks that, rhetoric by itself is a dangerous tool. This is what Plato picked up on as well. But here's where Aristotle and Cicero differ from Plato. It's also a necessary tool, because you have to compete against other philosophers and ordinary people and their ideas. So you need to be able to persuade, and you need to be able to organize your materials well. So you might look at his rhetorical treatises as well. You might also depend on what you're particularly interested in. If you're really interested in issues about the emotions, Tusculan Disputations, books 3 and 4. If you're really, really interested in the question of knowledge, the Academica is about that sort of thing. So it kind of depends on where your bent is. But the good thing is, if you gave it some time, you could probably read your way through all of the philosophical treatises, in a fairly short amount of time. And when I say short amount of time, I mean like over the course of a couple weeks if you're really spending a lot of time on it, or a couple months if it's more periodic that you're doing it. So I think that's some useful advice about where to start and how to do things. I do want to say one other thing about the how to start. So when you're approaching Cicero, it's important to keep in mind who this guy is and where he's coming from in philosophy. He is somebody who had the advantage of being able to study with a lot of really important representatives of the philosophical schools. So he got to study with, the hardcore Epicureans, the hardcore academic skeptics, the hardcore Stoics, the hardcore Aristotelian Peripatetics, right? So he got a really good education, and he also had access to books. He was a rich guy, not from an absolutely upper class family by Roman standards, but fairly high up there. And he was able to get his hands on books and study them. He had the opportunity to do that. He had leisure in which to do that. So you're going to be jumping into somebody who is not like beginning at a beginner level, right? He's not saying, let me explain Aristotle for the average Joe on the street. No, he's not doing that. He's expect to jump in at kind of a fast pace. The other thing that's important to think about is that he is within a set of traditions, and he assumes that the reader is going to be somewhat conversant with them, and that may not always be the case. That's why sometimes having all those footnotes and introductions can be really useful for you, or hopefully, the videos that I provide are useful for you as well. So that's information about how to get yourself started. I think that in order to get the most out of reading Cicero early on, you probably need to know something about what his overall project was and why he was doing that. That'll tell you a bit about why he's writing things in the way he is and making the arguments he is. Now, you'll get this out of the introductions to his various books when you put them all together, but it might be helpful to have that, before you actually jump in. So one of the key things that Cicero wanted to do was a linguistic project, a project of translation. Cicero was bothered by the fact that you had all of these elitist Romans, sort of like people who do this today with French or German, and they were like, you can't study, philosophy in any language other than Greek. So when we talk about philosophy, we'll only do it in Greek. We're not going to do it with that slumming language, Latin. And Cicero was like, no, the Latin language is pretty good. We may not have actually come up with all these ideas, but I think we can express it in Latin. And I'm going to show all of you that can be done. So that was one of his main projects. He's translating Greek philosophy into Latin, but he's not translating it word for word. He's doing a different kind of translation, that's a Latin word, by the way, translatio. He's carrying something from one place to another, and he's setting up his works to be for a Latin audience. Every once in a while he'll mention a Greek word, but he'll always tell you, here's a Latin equivalent for that word. Here's a way to express that word. So that's a really, I think, important key part of his project. He wants to write these books so that literate Romans, people throughout the empire, well, not the empire at that time, throughout the republic at that time. It's going to become an empire fairly quickly during his lifetime, towards the end of it, so that they can actually enjoy and get the benefit of Greek philosophy. So that's one key issue. He also is engaged in what we can call an encyclopedic project. He's not writing an encyclopedia like we think of, where there's like entries for each word, like Marcus Tullius Cicero, Roman statesman and orator, blah, 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 right? He's not doing that. Instead, he's writing books that are supposed to cover each major area and topic in philosophy. So he's trying to produce an encyclopedia of philosophy, one body of work that will give you all of the stuff that you need to know when you need to know it. So you want to know about your duties? Read On Duties, and maybe On the Ends, and also, Tusculan Disputations, and also this book and that book, right? You want to know how to speak well? On the Orator, or the Brutus, or, the topics. You need to have copia, right? That's what the topics are for. You want to know a little bit about Epicureanism and the academics' criticisms of the Epicureans' notions of innate ideas? Well, there you go. It's in the academics. And so, that's part of what he's doing. So when you're reading a work of his, you're actually reading a part of a larger body of work that's supposed to be, if not necessarily systematic in the sense that it's providing one coherent system, at least comprehensive. There's often a lot of points where you're like, man, I wish that Cicero would have talked more about this guy. Like, for example, I wish he'd talked more about Aristo, who was a sort of Stoic, and Hieronymus, who was sort of Aristotelian, because we've lost their works. But Cicero, I think he kind of assumed that people would have access to the works, so he's providing us with as much information as he thinks is necessary. Another thing to realize about his project is that for Cicero, philosophy was indeed a way of life. And this is an important idea in ancient times. It runs throughout medieval times, except for maybe some of the scholastic philosophy. But even a lot of that is actually connected with living philosophy. And it continues on in the modern period to some degree. It disappears with modern academic philosophy, which is rather abstract and uprooted from life contexts. For Cicero, as for the Stoics, as for the skeptics, as for the Epicureans, as for their later rivals in Jewish and Christian philosophy, as for the Platonists and the Neoplatonists and Middle Platonists, and even for the Aristotelians, philosophy was something that you would live. It was supposed to affect the way that you live. It was supposed to give you tools that you could use to understand things. It was supposed to help you work on your emotions. It was supposed to help you analyze what was going wrong with things and how you might make them better. So that's a motive in a lot of his works. He's not just writing it to write a treatise on this or that. It's supposed to be something that could in some way be applicable. The last thing I want to say about his project that I don't think you need to necessarily take into account, to help you understand the writings, but I think is good background knowledge, is Cicero was a busy guy. He was involved in Roman politics. He went through what was called the cursus honorum, these offices that you would do. He took part in rulership. He was actually offered a place in the triumvirate that Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed. It would have been a quadriumvirate, right? It would have been a four-person rule, and he turned them down. But why did they offer it to him? Because he was so important and so influential and so tied into politics. He took part in the civil war between Pompey and Caesar, picked the Pompey side reluctantly, sort of like Cato did as well. And they lost, and eventually Cicero would get killed by partisans of Mark Antony. His son managed to escape, fortunately. Cicero did a lot of his writing, not the political writings, the speeches. Those are obviously written for political purposes and not the letters. But he did a lot of his philosophical writings in what we can call his downtime. Downtime in two different ways. So when he was not as involved in political matters because he was out of power or couldn't do anything, then he used some of that time to write philosophy. It's also downtime in another way that might make you feel down. Cicero had a daughter who he loved very much and appears to have been his, in many respects, intellectual and practical equal. Her name was Tullia, and she was very involved in his life. As a matter of fact, he divorced his second wife in part because she couldn't get along with Tullia, and unfortunately Tullia died. She died before her father, and Cicero felt an incredible amount of grief over this. And so what did he do? He turned his grief into an opportunity to attain some sort of consolation by spending his time thinking about and writing about philosophy. So it was downtime in another sense, and that's kind of important to take into account, I think. So hopefully that helps you contextualize what this guy is up to, and so when you go to his works, keep all of that in mind, and I think that will help you frame things. There is one other thing that I do need to tell you about that. And I'm going to talk more about that in the next section. But here it is. Cicero identifies with a particular school of philosophy. The school that he identifies with is the academic skeptic school. Academic in that it's in Plato's Academy. Plato's Academy starts out with Plato, of course, and Aristotle's studying there, and so is Speusippus, who will get the job after Plato dies. He's Plato's nephew. And then there's a few others who are more or less faithful to Plato's project. And then the Academy gets taken over by these other people like Arcesilaus, right? And they're skeptics. There was skepticism before that. There's Pyrrho, but within the Academy they start saying, well, Socrates is this guy who says, I know that I don't know. Let's actually focus on knowledge and think about what we actually do know and what we don't know. And there's different kinds of skepticism. There's like a hardcore, man, we don't know anything, doubt everything kind of skepticism. And then there's a more moderate, Carneades sort of style of skepticism where they're like, I think we can at least have probabilities. We can't say anything for sure, but we can say, this is likely. I'm willing to revise my arguments later. Cicero belongs to that. And part of the reason why Cicero writes dialogues in which different philosophical schools are engaging with each other, and then you've also got Cicero sometimes as a character pointing out flaws in the different arguments, is because that's what academic skepticism looks like for him. It's not I doubt everything, I don't know, nobody can know anything. It's not any of that sort of stuff. It's the skeptics were the skeptikoi, seekers on a path. Cicero wants knowledge. He just wants to actually see what everyone else has to say about it and provide their best arguments and then see whether they're any good. That's part of his project. And I think he's doing that not just for us readers, but also for himself to some degree. I think there's a few things that I can say about the format of Cicero's text that may prove useful for you as you're beginning to study Cicero. And the first thing I have for you is a little bit of advice. Do not skip over the introductory material to jump right into the heart of it. Because Cicero in the introductory part is telling you why he wrote the book and what sort of take he's going to have on things, and he's also telling you about the larger project that I was just talking about earlier that he's involved in. Those are really important points early on, and sometimes they'll show up in introductions to different books in larger works. Books are sort of like chapters, right? Each one was a scroll. So don't skip that. Another thing I need to point out is the works that are fragmentary or incomplete. They're the best copies we have. The scholars have put together as much as we can reconstruct of Cicero's texts. That's what we've got to work with. So, don't feel dismayed or anything because you don't have the full Cicero's Republic. We have a good bit of it, and that's enough, right? So that's a format thing as well. Now, I want to talk about, I mentioned that a lot of his works are dialogues. There are a few that are not dialogues, but most of them are. The philosophical works. Obviously, his letters are letters and the speeches are speeches, right? Those aren't dialogues. Dialogues come in a lot of different formats, right? If you think about a Platonic dialogue or a dialogue by Xenophon, if you've read him, they're a bit different than Ciceronian dialogues. In Ciceronian dialogues, you've got like a starting point, and then somebody will say, I've been thinking about this issue, or I wonder what you Epicureans think, or you Stoics think, and then usually there's some guy there to say, well, I'll tell you all about it, right? And then they do for page after page after page in sort of systematic exposition, and then after that there'll be somebody else who will come in and say, I don't think I buy this part, and here's why. And then there might be some back and forth between them, but it's not a dialogue like a Shakespeare play or any other kind of play that you're used to where it's back and forth all the time. It's more like, here's a presentation, then we got some chit chat, and then some more presentation, back and forth like that. And so you might find that stylistically a little bit boring, but think of it this way. Cicero is doing his best to try to convey to us through these characters what it is that the different schools had to offer and how they thought of things. There's not a lot of, you could call it dramatic voice within the dialogue. I mean, there is sometimes a little bit of joking around and ribbing each other, right? Or saying, hey, your ancestors did this, and then you got to go look up who that person was. But it's not like Plato's dialogues where Thrasymachus comes in like a lion. Socrates, you sniveling, person, you should wipe your nose and pay me for teaching you about... There's nobody like that, really, in Cicero's dialogues. But there is a lot of discussion, however, of interesting characters, both in Greek and Roman settings, and sometimes in other settings as well. Another thing to remember, as an academic skeptic, Cicero feels himself entitled to be eclectic. So that means that he can, if he thinks that the Stoics have something right, he can take that from the Stoics and use it. If there's something else that he thinks the Aristotelians are completely correct about, like, for example, the importance of rhetoric, he's going to take that on, and he's going to have his characters, or himself as one of the characters, tell you all about it. So that's an important part of his dialogue format to keep in mind. He doesn't always show his hand in every single case, so that's also worth considering too. But you don't always have to worry about what is Cicero's own point of view. You can appreciate the dialogues, or the treatises, if you want to call them that, as sort of living, well thought out, well arranged expositions of a variety of different systematic philosophical viewpoints. So that's probably enough about format. If you're participating in the sort of wider world of philosophy, particularly if you're not doing it in an academic setting, but this also applies to that, but you're doing it in the sort of popular setting, which includes a lot of online discussions, you are going to see a lot of people saying things about Cicero that might make you feel a little bit concerned about whether you're getting things right or whether you're even wasting your time on somebody. And the two biggest things, I would say, have to do with whether he's original and therefore important, and whether he belongs to this school or that school. So let's talk about the second one first, right? Particularly since there's a lot of online forums devoted to Stoics and Stoicism, and there's a lot of people involved in them who have a very low level of understanding at this point in time, which I'm not complaining about. That's what forums are for, like Facebook groups and things like that. People will bring up Cicero, and they will say, well, you should study Cicero because he's a Stoic. He's not a Stoic. He does, in fact, take a lot from Stoicism, and he does argue for Stoicism in works like the Stoic Paradoxes, right? But Cicero is not a Stoic. He is an eclectic who takes on a lot of elements of Stoicism into his moral theory where he thinks the Stoics have things right. He also takes a lot from Aristotle, and in fact, he makes the argument at certain points, and some people think that he's completely, serious about this. Others think, maybe he's just sort of trying on ideas, that the Stoics and the Aristotelians are actually doing the same thing, just calling things by different names. That's another issue that we could go into. But he's neither an Aristotelian nor a Stoic. Formally speaking, he is an academic skeptic, or just call him an academic, because he tells us he belongs to that school. In practice, however, that means that he is an eclectic. Now, an eclectic could be a sort of smorgasbord kind of person where I just pick a little bit of this and a little bit of this and kind of put them all together into some sort of composite mess. And I mean mess rather than mass, right? Or an eclectic could be somebody who's much more careful and they're like, I like that over there. That seems to work. I like this over here. Let's see if we can put these together. Oh, it's kind of tough to make them fit. We got to grow this here and add a bit here and maybe shave a little bit of this off here. Now they're coming together. That's the kind of eclectic that Cicero is. And he can do so thinking that that's what it means for him to be an academic. He is not an academic skeptic, as I've mentioned, thinking that we can't know anything and Socrates was great because he says he doesn't, he knows what he doesn't know. That is not the kind of academic that Cicero is. Cicero thinks we can know things, and he thinks that we ought to know things, and we just have to get them from multiple sources. So that's one problem we can kind of put aside. Don't get worried when people start telling you who Cicero was and what kind of philosophical position he had, because most of the people out there saying that sort of thing in the popular philosophy sphere don't know what they're talking about. The other issue is one that actually comes up a little bit more from academic philosophy, both the academic philosophy of the present and that going back to the 19th century. As I mentioned, Cicero was very widely read and highly respected throughout the history of philosophy into the 18th century. In the 19th century, it's not just Cicero, but Hellenistic philosophy in general tends to get dismissed. That includes the Epicureans, that includes the Stoics, that includes the Middle Platonists, that includes the Skeptics. The idea that the Greek city-state declining, meant that Plato and Aristotle, their grand vision, had sort of an end point, and now we're in that degenerate Alexandrian Hellenistic philosophy, which is really no good. That was a prevalent conception. You see Hegel saying stuff like that. You see other people, saying Windelband, popular historian of philosophy, writing in German, who influenced a lot of Americans. You see people like Heidegger saying ridiculous things in the 20th century, like, really, you can only, do philosophy in a philosophical language, and those would be Greek and German, not Latin. There's a lot of that sort of stuff out there, and it's still floating around, and a lot of people in academia were taught that sort of thing in the little bit of history of philosophy that they got, but that's weak kind of bunk. It's not really based in a thorough study of the texts from a viewpoint that didn't already have these blinders on about the unimportance of Hellenistic philosophy. It's becoming recognized more and more just how important Cicero is, and that's good. And the same thing is happening with the Stoics and the Epicureans and the Skeptics and Middle Platonists, not just Neoplatonists like Plotinus, but Middle Platonists like Plutarch. So Cicero's star is rising again. There was, another criticism that was made along those lines. Well, he's not original, He's just taking ideas of other people and repackaging them in a Roman culture and Latin language garb. And, I think to some degree that's true. But Cicero didn't aim to be original. And as a matter of fact, most philosophers throughout that time weren't aiming to be original either. That's a weird, romantic, late modern notion that a lot of people have that you don't need to buy into. You don't need... As a matter of fact, it's good that Cicero is faithfully representing to us what the Epicureans thought. We don't want him being all that original when he's presenting them. We want him to stick to topic and tell us just what the hell these people said, right? Do the original stuff later on your own time. So that's not something that I think you have to worry about. As a matter of fact, the what people are perceiving as his weakness is really a strength of his philosophical work. So that's probably enough about that. What are my last thoughts about Cicero and you engaging in self-directed study of him? Well, I think if you want to know ancient philosophy, or if you want a good grounding that's going to help you with medieval and early modern philosophy, definitely somebody you got to read. And I think that you're going to find him to be a surprisingly helpful and interesting source of ideas and information. And you'll also start to appreciate him as a writer and thinker in his own respect. So, it's a bit more challenging than some of the other philosophers you might reading Cicero, but it's well worth your time. And if you're going to do it, let me, congratulate you on picking some great project for yourself that's going to fill in a lot of gaps. If you're not yet convinced, then maybe watch the video again, and maybe I'll convince you. Or read those 3 books that I mentioned, or in the part about how to start. Read the on friendship and on fate and Stoic paradoxes, and see what you think. See whether he's worth going into or not. I think that you'll be convinced that Cicero is well worth studying. He's one of my favorite philosophers. I'm very happy to give you a little bit of advice that I hope will be helpful for you as you carry on your own self-directed study of Cicero. And that's pretty much all that I've got.